Department of Sociology. On behalf of myself and my class, who's dispersed throughout the group, okay, you can raise your hands. I'm just kidding, we don't. I'd like to welcome you to this very important talk. Now, what I'd like to do first, though, I'd like to introduce someone who is going to introduce the star attraction. And by star attraction, those are Gary's words. Okay. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce Professor Emeritus from Laurantian, Dr. Gary Kinsman. Gary taught in our department for many years. I won't say how many, but upon retirement, I think he might have become busier. Okay, so currently he's splitting his time between Toronto and Sudbury, and forgive my notes, okay, but I have to use these. Right now in Toronto, amongst many other things, okay, Gary's working with the Queer Trans Community Defense downtown Toronto East. Also, Gary is a long-term supporter of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. In Sudbury, a supporter member of the Raise the Rates campaign group. Now, Gary told me to keep it short, right? Since he isn't the main speaker, but I would like to also add to this, if you would like to join, subscribe to or follow Gary's blog, Radical Noise, that would be a great place for you to either get more information or even better, get involved. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Gary.
I should point out that I have the status of doctor, but I have no license to operate. Dana's been a wonderful colleague for me, and also a really important social justice activist in a whole bunch of different areas, including Palestine solidarity work and including LGBT struggles and rights. So I just wanted to acknowledge that also in terms of Dana. So in terms of the talk tonight, I wanted to say two things before introducing John Clarke, who is the main attraction for this event. First of all, I want to recognize that we're on Indigenous land, that we're on the historic and continuing territories of the Tecumseh Anishinaabe people and the Anishinaabe people more generally. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that all the time, that we basically are on stolen land, and to recognize the significance of Indigenous struggles and the continuing resilience of the Indigenous people of these territories. So I just wanted to acknowledge that to begin with. So John Clarke, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, is here as part of a broader campaign and a broader tour of Sudbury. He's here as part of the Raise the Rates campaign, which is a group that was formed probably more than 10 years ago, a coalition between anti-poverty activists, community groups, and the union movement, sections of the union movement, that is campaigning for raising social assistance rates, but also raising minimum wage rates at the same time. So raising the rates of everyone who is living in poverty in the province. So he's here as part of the Raise the Rates campaign, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, of which John is a very active and central member, has been quite crucial to the Raise the Rates campaign. And he's speaking here, again at the University tomorrow at 10, and I'll come back to that later on, and also at a community meal and discussion downtown tomorrow evening. So in terms of John, so I've known John for a long time. John is one of, I have to say, one of the most solid social justice activists I've ever met in my life. He is also one of the best orators, political orators, that I've ever met in my life. So I'm really very pleased that I'm able to introduce John here today. John came to Canada from England, and 33 years ago was the formation of one of the first groups he was involved in when he came to Canada, which is the London Union of Unemployed Workers. That's 33 years ago. And 25 years ago, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty was formed, and John has been involved in the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty throughout all of that time period. John has been an incredible organizer around anti-poverty questions. And I also want to just stress that John's done an awful lot of work in Toronto, where the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty is based, but it's also provided invaluable support for people outside Toronto. So just in terms of some of the history of John's support for struggles in Sudbury, he's been an indispensable support for direct action-based anti-poverty organizing here in the city, and especially in relationship to the Raise the Rates campaign, various different struggles that have been organized around the special diet campaign, which I'm not sure you'll mention today, and also in defense of the community startup and maintenance benefit. But John's also come up to Sudbury on a number of other occasions where he provided support for the union movement. So one of the first times I remember John coming up the first two times, I'll just mention this. Once was when we had a huge demonstration of about 4,000 people against Mike Harris over at the hotel over there, just in the midst of a teacher's strike as well. So John actually, if I'm not mistaken, spoke at that rally, but also did an anti-poverty workshop around the same time. And then John came up in 2001 to support the mine mill strike in Falconbridge and was part of the Solidarity Weekend there. So John's been a very strong supporter of struggles here and also the organizing of struggles all across the province. So I'm now going to just introduce John to talk to you about why the struggle against poverty must be anti-colonialist and anti-capitalist.
To step back from day-to-day struggles and look more at the question of how poverty is situated in this society and how poverty must be addressed. And the specific question is why the struggle against poverty must be both anti-colonialist and anti-capitalist. An interesting question. I'm going to try to explore it. And because I think that colonialism flows out of a capitalist system, we're going to reverse the order, and I'm going to begin with the question of the anti-capitalist nature of challenging poverty. See, in our organisation, which has been around, which has been rooted in poor communities, and struggling against a mounting austerity agenda now for some 25 years, we've always put forward the position that it is because we are an anti-poverty organisation that we must also be, at the same time, an anti-capitalist organisation. And this is not because we approach this out of a desire to be in some way just radical in our perspective, but for us it's a much more important and practical question. Because as far as we're concerned, unemployment and poverty that we see around us, that we experience all the time, are not simply reversible side effects that need a bit of tinkering and adjustment, but they are something much more than that. They are necessary and integral parts of the system of capitalism. And I'm going to try and demonstrate that by talking a little bit historically. And to do that, I think we have to look back in history to a period in which a system of capitalism was being introduced. And to do that, you have to go back to Europe. In fact, probably England is the classical beginning point in terms of the emergence of a capitalist system. And what we see in, let's say, the 1500s, is we see an increasing process of driving the peasants off of their land holdings and creating a modern working class, creating a population of people who, rather than having a piece of land that they can subsist on, are forced to sell their ability to work to an employer in order to survive. And if you're going to do that, and they made it an absolute necessity, it wasn't a voluntary thing, they drove people off of their land. If you're going to do that, what you're going to be able to sell your ability to work for is a really important question. And one of the ways in which they ensured, by they I mean the employers, one of the ways in which they ensured they got the best possible deal was to ensure that the workers who were working and the workers who were looking for work were not in a strong bargaining position. And to do that, they created a surplus. They created a surplus within the working class population. They didn't sort of say, you know, we have X number of jobs opening up in Manchester, let's drive a corresponding number of peasants off of the land and it'll all work out fairly. They just drove people off en masse. And they created a whole section of the population that had no immediate access to the workforce, that had no jobs, that was landless, that was homeless, that was hungry, that was desperate. And so they looked to actually use that force as a weapon. Now, the only limitations that are imposed on that use of creating a climate of desperation is, of course, that people will rebel. People will struggle to survive. There will be social unrest, which is really the only thing in the end, and I'll come back to that, but it's the only thing that the poor really have to bargain with, is the capacity for social unrest. And so they realized that in order to do that, in order to control that, they would have to find the means to limit social unrest. And initially, the authorities of the day used just simply state repression. The Tudor authorities, by which I mean, you know, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, those people, they at first just tried to use simple methods of state repression in order to ensure that the poor were passive. They came up with a concept that they called the King's Peace, which wasn't really very peaceful. But the idea of the King's Peace was that a system of law and order would be imposed. One particular academic, Laurantian, said that the greatest achievement of the Tudor kings and queens was the creation of a royal monopoly on violence. And that's exactly what they did. They tried to ensure that the poor were kept in line by simple violence. In the reign of Henry VIII in 1537, they passed a piece of legislation saying that if you were found without work, the penalty would be to be tied to a cart tail and whipped. And for a second offence, you would be whipped again, and this time half of one of your ears would be cut off. And on the third occasion, you'd be hung. And then in the 10 years later, when Edward, the very pious boy king, was on the throne, they decided they were being too lenient, so they came up with an intensification. And in addition to the above-mentioned punishments, the person that turns you in obtained the right to take your children and have them as their servant until they reached the age of majority. So it was really quite brutal. But the authorities of the day had a problem on their hands, which was that in those days the deployment of state repression was not as mobile as it is today. They couldn't helicopter people in. They didn't have highways that they could send SUVs full of cops down. And so if people were trying to survive, and in those days they didn't call people single employables, they called them vagabonds. In those days, if vagabonds were trying to survive, they would go to a community, take what they needed, and if they had any sense, they wouldn't be around by the time the authorities mobilised enough people to deal with the problem. And so they reluctantly decided that they had a problem on their hands that couldn't be dealt with just with the billy club, that they were reluctantly going to have to make some level of concession. And so they came up with a system that became known as the Poor Laws. And various brands of that were introduced, but 1601 was the big one under the reign of Elizabeth. They introduced a system called the Poor Laws, and the idea of the Poor Laws was you could receive a level of relief, but it would be degrading, it would be humiliating, it would be as inadequate as possible. And in order to receive it, the idea is that you would have to go into an institution called the workhouse, where you would be a pariah, and where you would be given the barest subsistence for the most terrible conditions, under the most terrible conditions. Now, what then happened is that poor people again rebelled against the workhouse system. This theme of rebellion and resistance is a very important one. People rebelled against the conditions of the workhouses, and people demanded, instead of indoor relief in the workhouses, outdoor relief, meaning that they would receive subsistence items but not have to go into the workhouse in order to receive them. And for about 2.5 centuries across England, the most brutal, I don't think it can be described in any other way, but a class war existed over whether or not people would be forced into the workhouses. And there were all kinds of rebellions. Workhouses were burned to the ground. In some cases, workhouse masters were lynched by angry mobs. People fought for the right to obtain relief without going into the workhouses. In the 1800s, just at the same time as they were beginning to put in place the modern police forces that exist today, they also decided that they needed to intensify the poor law system. And so they formed an English Poor Law Reform Commission, headed up by a Cambridge economist by the name of Nassau W. Senior. And they came up with a set of findings that basically said that as this industrial revolution is getting underway and as we need a more submissive and cheaper workforce, the poor laws are very, very necessary. They must be enforced much more strictly. And they actually they came up with a concept that has become very important in terms of studying social policy, called less eligibility. And the idea of less eligibility put forward by the Poor Law Reform Commission was that if you were going to receive relief, it was necessary, first of all, that it be set at levels that was as low as it possibly could be. If possible, lower than the lowest paying forms of work. That wasn't always possible. But in addition, it should be as inadequate, not just inadequate, but it should be as degrading and humiliating as it possibly could be. The circumstances of receiving relief should be dreadful. Now there was a assistant poor law reform commission in the county of Kent by the name of Francis Bond Head, who put forward an argument in one of his essays called English Charity that less eligibility must be strictly enforced and our workhouses must be repulsive institutions. His words. Now, he's an interesting man because about a year after he wrote those words, he got on a boat and came over here and became the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. And a year later, the Toronto House of Industry opened its doors, the first of the poor law-based workhouses in this province. And to give you a sort of a flavour of how that place operated, in the Toronto House of Industry, you would get a cup of tea and a slice of bread and a bare concrete floor to sleep on. And in return, you were expected to chop wood. And then they decided that chopping wood was just a bit too liberally, so they decided instead that you would have to crack the stone, that you would have to break rocks with a sledgehammer. And if you refused, you were brought before the magistrates, and the normal penalty was 3 months in jail for vagrancy. So those were the conditions that were imposed. And again, the point to stress is that this is not just a question of vicious, nasty people doing dreadful things, although there were many of those. But the real issue is that what they were seeking to create was a climate of desperation and submission that would enable there to be a plentiful supply of the lowest paying workers. And that theme is absolutely central and is more important today, more central today, I think, and we'll come to that. Now, poor law-based system, generally speaking, although here it was operated with less state control than it was in the UK, a poor law-based system remained essentially municipally delivered about what was available to people outside of various charitable networks. And by the time of the 1930s Great Depression, you saw a situation where that system was challenged because you had this enormous mass of people who found themselves unemployed. You had a crisis within the capitalist system internationally led to mass unemployment, and all that people had to turn to was this inadequate 19th century Victorian system of providing relief, and people rebelled against it. And at first, the authorities were determined to make no concessions. In 1929, a delegation of the unemployed went before the Prime Minister of the day, R.B. Bennett, and argued for the introduction of a system of unemployment insurance. And Bennett's reply was, "Never will I, or any government I am part of, put a premium on idleness." And yet, a few years later, Bennett tabled a bill for the introduction of unemployment insurance. And municipalities and provinces across Canada put much more money into relief than they intended to. And this wasn't because of any change of heart. It wasn't because they became compassionate. It was because there was an enormous movement of the unemployed in those times that challenged the system and forced concessions and used that threat and sometimes reality of social unrest amongst poor and unemployed people to win concessions. By the end, the 30s depression ended, culminated, of course, in the Second World War. But coming out of the Second World War, what you saw was a whole upsurge, a social upsurge that demanded improvements. There was a strong union movement. There was a really powerful challenge to the system. Sit-down strikes occurred. Huge workers' strikes broke out, and it led to a situation where the authorities of the day felt compelled to put resources into strengthening the social infrastructure. Unemployment insurance systems were put in place, pensions, unions were recognised and dealt with, a welfare system was put in place that, while it was the low end in terms of the concession package, meant that there was some level of income support being provided even to the poorest people. Throughout the period of the 50s and 60s, that continued to strengthen, and then we saw a situation where the very improvements that had been won, not so much in social programs but in workers' wages through trade union struggles, was beginning to cut into the rate of profit. The post-war boom period starts to come to an end in the late 60s, and you start to see them rethinking how they're going to deal with these issues. And so the strategy of Keynesian deficit financing that had taken place during the post-war years starts to be called into question, and they start to rethink. You think of particularly an economist like Milton Friedman out of the University of Chicago, who begins to think about different ways of doing things, about taking back those gains, about removing barriers on the making of profit, on limiting the social gains of the past. And they begin to think very seriously about how unemployment can be used as a weapon to drive down wages. And Friedman was involved, he wasn't the only one, but he was one of the thinkers who started to develop the notion of a natural rate of unemployment. Right? The theory of a natural rate of unemployment, actually central banks subscribe to it. I'm not making this up, you can look on their websites. Central banks subscribe to the notion that a certain level of unemployment is necessary in order to restrain wages. And they will actually implement policies to ensure that calculated rate of unemployment is obtained by raising interest rates, etc. So they begin to drive up levels of unemployment. They begin to take a lot of industry offshore. But what they also realise that it isn't enough to simply make people unemployed. People need to be desperate. So two of the Chicago economists associated with Friedman write a paper in 1974, and they pose the question, why is it, it's 1974, why is it that unemployment levels are higher than they've been since the Great Depression, and yet wages don't seem to be really falling? And the conclusion they come to is this, their words, they say, the the existence of unemployment insurance and welfare programs have made unemployment insufficiently terrifying. And so they realised that the driving down of the adequacy of income support programs is an absolutely central consideration. And ever since, over the decades that have followed, we've seen the implementation of that agenda. It's generally presented as a kind of a deficit control measure, but that really isn't the driving force. That really isn't the primary consideration. It is about intensifying the level of desperation and intensifying the scramble for the lowest paying jobs on offer. Here in Ontario, of course, the Harris welfare cuts of the 1990s were a quantum leap in terms of actually implementing that agenda, as was the incredible erosion of unemployment insurance, later called employment insurance, at the federal level. Since the Liberals came to power in 2003, while they haven't been as flamboyant as Harris, they have in fact consolidated and indeed intensified that agenda. And it's generally reckoned today, I think, that the adequacy of social assistance programs in Ontario are probably well over 50% below where they were in 1994 in terms of spending power and adequacy. And it's interesting that you can correlate entirely and exactly the driving down of wages and the proliferation of a whole population of people working for the lowest paying jobs. Since 2003, when the Liberals took power on a mandate of change and improvement, the numbers of people working for the minimum wage has actually doubled. And I would certainly argue that without the driving down of income support programs, without the attack on welfare rates and those things, it would not have been possible for them to get away with that. We've arrived at a situation now where, as Gary said, I'm based in Toronto. If you take the Greater Toronto area and Hamilton and consider them as one area, then today we have a situation where the percentage of the workforce that has full-time permanent jobs is actually a minority. Most workers have precarious jobs or part-time jobs of one kind or another. And today, I think they're even intensifying this agenda further with an attack on the disabled. There used to be, in Tudor times, when they elaborated the poor laws, they had a concept of the deserving and the undeserving poor. I think today they don't even think in those terms. Coming out of the UK, we've seen an incredible attack on disability benefits that has taken place over the last number of years. They've put in place a system called the Work Capability Assessment, under which people who are disabled, people who are sick, people in some cases who are terminally ill are being deemed fit to work and having their benefits cut off. And they have clearly begun to move in the same direction here, with the intention of, again, intensifying this scramble for the lowest paying jobs on offer. So that is why we would argue in our organisation that we can't address the question of this system as simply one that needs to be tinkered with, that we are actually dealing with a system for which the creation of unemployment and poverty as an integral part of how it functions is absolutely essential. But I would like to also address the other side of the question that we pose, that of anti-colonialism, because that too is a very, very vital consideration. Today, we live in a country that has been, of course, as Gary said at the outset, established on stolen land. And I think that an understanding of that is absolutely essential to not only a struggle for poverty, but a struggle for any struggle for social justice must be waged on that basis. Canada is not just, however, and I'll return to this in a minute, but Canada is not just a a colonial power in terms of how it established itself as a separate state. But European colonialism was an enormous development within the capitalist system itself. And what it established was a world system in which there were oppressor and oppressed countries. It created a situation where large parts of the globe were subjected to primarily European colonization. And that system today has not gone away. The removal of the 19th century formal colonial empires of Britain and France and other countries has been replaced by a system of colonial domination that for the most part doesn't rule through direct rule under the leadership, of course, of the United States. But it does nonetheless operate on the basis of entirely colonial systems of domination and exploitation. And that, we must understand, I think, is important in terms of assessing Canada's place in the world. Canada is not, even though it lives along the boundaries of a much greater economic and military power, Canada is not an oppressed country. Canada is very much an oppressor country internationally. 75% of the world's mining companies are headquartered in Canada. 40% of the world's mining capital is raised on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Canada, on a world scale, ask people in Honduras, ask people in Guatemala. Canada, on a world scale, is very much a dominant and exploiting and a colonial power. And it's not going to be possible to attack that system without attacking that whole colonial basis. And moreover, that legacy of colonialism has affected how the population is organised in this country. There exists within the system of capitalist exploitation in Canada a racial hierarchy that is very much the legacy of colonialism and is very much in effect. It's in effect in terms of how populations within the workforce are exploited, and it's very much in effect in terms of how the system of immigration is in place. There used to be a time when people would come to Canada as they would apply, they would come here, they would live as immigrants for a period, they would obtain Canadian citizenship, and they would become part of a long-term immigrant population. Today, people are not being brought here on that basis. They're being brought here on the most part as what the Germans would call guest workers, as temporary workers, to be used for a period of time and then thrown out of the country again, to be super exploited. So if we're addressing poverty and exploitation, an understanding of that has got to be absolutely essential. And then finally, if we address the question of colonialism, we have to address, as I said at the beginning of this portion, how Canada was established and how Canada operates. Describing the system of capitalism emerging in Britain, you're talking about peasants being driven off the land. That wasn't how it was done here. Capitalism was brought in on ships, and an indigenous population was dispossessed and was subjected to genocide. And I don't think the genocide term causes discomfort, but I don't think for a moment it can be in any way seen as an exaggeration. The Canadian rulers have always tried to present the notion that things were somehow kinder and gentler here than they were south of the border. Not for the Beartuck people of Newfoundland, who were exterminated down to the last human being. Not for the people on the plains who were subjected to starvation to force them into the reservation system. This great injustice was the basis for the establishment of the country. And if we're going to talk about movements of resistance, if we don't base our movements of resistance on an understanding of the fact that Canada was established on that basis, that it remains a settler state, a colonial settler state, then I don't think we can understand very much. And the final thing I'd say with regards to the sort of the colonial system that was imposed on Indigenous people here is we would be making a profound mistake if, as perhaps Justin Trudeau would like to present it, it's this unfortunate legacy of the past that somehow is very unfortunate, and wish it hadn't happened, and we're going to all set it right, and we're in for sunny days ahead. That I don't think is the reality at all. I talked about Canada's role as a mining power. The attack on Indigenous land is increasing and intensifying. The colonial process in this country is not something that is a legacy of the past, it's an intensifying present-day reality. So with all those considerations in mind, I hope I've provided at least some salvageable, workable answers to the initial proposition of why a struggle against poverty must be a struggle against capitalism and must be a struggle against colonialism. We are attacking poverty on a daily basis. We are fighting day-to-day defensive struggles sometimes. But the vision and the goal that we must have, and what motivates us and how we build, is that we want to build a society that is not based on profit, not based on greed, not based on exploitation, but based on solidarity, based on full economic democracy, based on a settling of accounts with racism, and based on absolute solidarity with Indigenous sovereignty. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, John. So we've got lots of time for discussion. I just wanted to leave early that there's this little pamphlet called the Vision of Prosperity that's on the front table that people can see on the screen. And there's also a picture book on the history of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty that is basically on a sliding scale, whatever you can pay is there. And then we're going to have a discussion period now, but I think that, Leslie, you wanted to make a quick announcement.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that I'm going to pass around a possible sign-up sheet. No major obligation if you put your email address or cell phone number down. Just that the Raise the Rates Sudbury campaign would be able to keep in touch with you, let you know stuff that's going on. Yeah, it's there's not a lot of lines on these pages, but scribble, turn it over, whatever you need to do. If you want to just pass it on. Thank you very much. And the poster about the, the events that are happening today and tomorrow here, but the community meal and meeting where John is speaking as well. Did you already mention that?
No, but we'll come back to it at the end. But yeah, that's great to remind people about that. I also wanted to just mention that we're actually really fortunate today because we have the two organizers of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty in this room. They're both actually in Sudbury right now. So I don't know what's happening in Toronto, but how could you be organizing them both here? Anyway, there's other people I know who are there. But I'd like to just introduce Yogi Acharya. Is that close enough? Yeah. Okay. Who is a new organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. Do you want to say anything about it? Maybe we should take a couple of questions and then John can respond. Is there anyone else who wants to raise a question right now?
Curious about your thoughts on the recent budget announcement in Ontario to do a pilot for guaranteed income.
Anyone else have a question for right now?
Okay, well, two meaty questions to begin with. All right. I mean, automation. It sort of really comes back to the question that I was trying to sort of address at the end, in the sense of what kind of society are we trying to build, and who's going to actually be calling the shots in that society. I mean, if you you have a system where, I just saw a report came out from Oxfam, that at the moment there are 62 human beings. They couldn't all sit on a school bus, but they could get on there and sit on each other's laps, and they could get on a school bus. And they have as much wealth as half the population of the planet. Right? That's how things are divided, that's how it's organized. Now, if you imagine a world in which you have millions of people working, and you have those 62 people running things, and automation is introduced, I mean, it does sound pretty dreadful, because they're going to use that to get rid of people, they're going to use that to increase the level of exploitation. But that doesn't mean that automation is inherently a bad thing. It actually, in a rationally planned, fair, just society, you're actually talking about the ability to increase production. You're actually talking about the ability to limit the amount of hours that people have to work. You're actually talking about something that potentially has benefits. That isn't to say that all automation is inherently good, but I'm saying that such things, it depends on the kind of society we have. I mean, automation has been used to weakening the bargaining power of workers, and potentially could to an even greater extent. But that's another reason why I think we have to build a society that's organised differently, so that the benefits of labour-saving equipment can actually benefit people as a whole, not just the bottom line of people who own businesses. So I think that's sort of the essential of it. Basic income is I think, a difficult question to grapple with. I mean, to argue that there should be a certain basic level that people should be at, and that people shouldn't fall below, is, I think, no one's going to disagree with that. The problem I think we have is, well, there's a couple of things that concern us anyway about the basic income concept. First of all, there is absolutely no denying that that over the years, people who have a very right-wing perspective have embraced basic income. I mentioned Milton Friedman; he was certainly one of them. Just a few years ago, Charles Murray in the US, also a really terrible conservative, actually embraced the idea. So there is a right-wing vision of basic income that I think understands that you reduce the adequacy of programs to a kind of a lowest common denominator, and that also at the same time there's dangers in terms of it being used as a kind of a wage top-up system to ensure that low-wage employers don't have to pay full wages, but it's paid for out of state revenues. And there's even, I think, a vision of basic income that sort of has the notion that you give everybody a certain minimum cash payment, and then you basically destroy public services and require of them that they buy those things in the private marketplace. And that could potentially apply to transportation, healthcare, certainly income support programs. So there are great dangers, I think, that lie ahead with the basic income vision. And if it's being advanced by the Liberals at the moment, I think the other thing that we need to look at is the fact that what I tried to put across in my presentation was that the driving down of the adequacy of income support programs is actually a strategic objective. I don't think that's going to go away simply because the basic income is floating. So I think it's a gift horse we need to look very closely at the mouth when it comes to. And if we are going to argue for a basic income system, we're going to have to put forward very clear demands about the things that we want about it, rather than just accept that somehow it's all going to be worked out by the people in Ottawa or the people in Queen's Park, because the version that they would produce left to their own devices is dangerous. So I think it's a complex question, but it's one that's got to be looked at very seriously and treated with, at least with extreme skepticism in our view.
Other questions, comments? Yeah.
There's been a petition about separating Northern Ontario. What's your take on that?
Separating Northern Ontario?
Yeah, to a new province of its own. Do you think it would make a difference?
I don't think I'm really in a position to know or say, Charles.
Yeah. Like, I mean, Toronto region and all that has its own problems.
I think there has been obviously there's no denying that, funnily enough, the country I come from has exactly the same issue. Northern England experience, Northern Ontario has unquestionably faced incredible levels of disadvantage and neglect by the central planners and how investments are made and all the rest of it. And the fact that it's been used as a place to extract resources from has been, all these things are absolutely and unquestionably true. Whether popular movements want to actually argue for some form of political jurisdictional separation or not is, I think that's something to leave to people in Northern Ontario. But I think if we're building movements for social justice, what's happened in Sudbury and beyond has been, this is a major question that's got to be paid attention to.
Yeah, like cost of living is more around here, and social assistance is the same thing regardless where you are in Ontario. So I mean, yeah.
I mean, if I could just add one thing to that, I mean, I think, I don't particularly have a position on this question either, but it seems to me that what would really need to be thought through is, first of all, Northern Ontario includes is First Nations territory, right?
Yeah.
So First Nations people actually, Indigenous people actually have the right to self-determination here, and if they want to become entirely separate from the Canadian state, that's entirely up to them, and we will support, at least I will support, their rights to do that. But if you're talking about the rights of settlers who come here on that stolen land to actually have the same type of right to self-determination, I would actually question that. So that's one thing. And the other thing I just wanted to add in is, it's also a question for us of like, are we in a stronger position or a weaker position if that would happen? Because like, we would also be denying ourselves all of the solidarity and support that we could get from other oppressed people, Indigenous people, and anti-poverty movements across the province as a whole. So those are just some of the things you might want to think about
Yeah.
in that context.
Okay.
So we can, any other questions? I'm interested in people who haven't yet spoken, and then we'll come back to you.
I ran an editorial in the KW Record a few weeks ago, and I was down there, and although I apologize, I don't have the exact facts, it was something to the notion of the minimum wage, and how the majority of people working for minimum wage right now, and I believe it said something like 70%, are students who already live at home with their parents anyway. They're not people that are actually trying to live off of that wage. And I thought I cut the article out and I have it at home, but I thought, now could that possibly be true?
I think, if I remember rightly, that was Fraser Institute, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I don't have all the arguments and responses in my mind ready to go, but I know there's been a meticulous response, which we can certainly readily find, that actually shows the really dubious. The Fraser Institute has a history of seizing upon things and misusing and misrepresenting arguments, and how they determine this population of people who are privileged and at home and all the rest of it has been subject to their methodology has been questioned and refuted quite successfully. So that can be found fairly regularly.
Right.
So I apologise for having all the information.
No, I appreciate that.
And just to mention, if people don't know what the Fraser Institute is, it's a right-wing think tank that was established a long time ago. And basically, it's been part of the attempt to shift everything in the Canadian state to the right. So its research is entirely directed in that direction. So most people treat what the Fraser Institute comes up with a great deal of skepticism.
Yes.
What do you think the future in Canada holds for the uneducated, unemployed, based off the fact that disposable workers today can be easily hired and fired, have the highest education and skill levels they have ever had before? So if I'm like an unemployed guy with no education, and this guy over here beside me has, like, you understand my question?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's certainly true that in terms of job markets and all the rest of it, there may well be advantages in education, there may well be disadvantages in lack of education. But I think it's probably a mistake to view things in terms of just how educated the people are. If more people be more educated, then there'd be all this employment. I think they organise the economy along certain lines, and they want a large disposable workforce. They want a precarious workforce, and maybe in this society at the moment, people with, generally speaking, with less education find themselves in that situation. But if everybody had a university degree, then there'd be a lot of precarious, low-wage workers with university degrees. So I think it's probably a mistake to view it as to view the thing just through the prism of how much education there is. You have to look at how the economy is actually working.
Did that address your question? Okay. Any other questions? If not, we're going to come back to you for your second question.
Sure. I guess it was really looking at the anti-colonialism, portion of the conversation. This is something that sort of consumes my thinking in a lot of ways, and particularly around building Indigenous sovereignty and what that means, right? I spent a lot of time working for Indigenous governance organizations, and very much, saw behind the curtain a little bit in that very much that is a dominated by Indigenous people, card-carrying, people that hold Western philosophy and are seeking a presence within what would be the colonial government of Canada, right? And so very much subscribe to the thought that we're not at the seventh fire, we're at the fifth, right? And finding the falsehoods behind those promises, right? And I see some of that reflected in yesterday's budget. I'm curious as to, what you see as a, anti-colonialism is a process, it's not necessarily an end goal, but what do you see as a future that's down a different path?
Maybe just at this point, are there any other comments or questions? Remember, people can just raise comments, you don't have to have a fully formed question.
I just wanted to ask about the relationships. You did a really good job of making poverty essential to the current economic system, as the climate crisis is also, or the use of the planet is essential, or the degradation of the planet is also essential to the current economic system, right? Its use or overuse. So I've heard talk about using the climate crisis to mobilize anti-poverty movements or create coalitions. Is there anything?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in terms of sort of incorporating an anti-colonialist perspective, building an anti-colonialist struggle as part of the struggle that we're taking up. I mean, I think that we're talking about a situation where the settler society itself is profoundly divided, and there are huge injustices within it. And so there are those of us who are settlers who find ourselves struggling against injustices. And the case I was trying to make really was that it would be impossible to actually proceed with that without actually building a relationship of solidarity with the struggle for sovereignty by Indigenous people. What would that mean? What would it mean in terms of, well, first of all, it means in the present struggles actually uniting and struggling against poverty and struggling to put forward demands of Indigenous sovereignty. But I think in the end, what we're talking about, if we're talking about building a society that's based on solidarity, we're talking about building a society that is based on real social justice, and we're talking about for the first time actually addressing questions of nations negotiating in good faith around what is fair. What has been established in the territory that is now Canada is a situation where people have been left on 0.2% of the land, right? And that has created enormous issues of poverty and abandonment and on all those things. And that would have to actually be reversed. And it would be based, of course, on the demands and the decisions of Indigenous people themselves. What kind of a relationship would Indigenous people want? Would they want complete independence? Would they want to build some kind of cooperative working relationship with the with a Canadian society? Those things are going to have to be worked out in the future. But the immediate question, I think, is to build a movement in which no one gets left behind and no one is ignored, and we put Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous rights and Indigenous struggles actually at the front of the whole thing. And that's, in some ways, I acknowledge we've got to find answers as we go, but the general sense I'm trying to put forward is one of building a society in which Indigenous sovereignty is respected, and in the present context, linking our struggles together. On climate, it seems to me that I mean, there are immediate and important questions why poor people need to be heavily involved in struggles for climate justice. And you see that in the fact that it's the poor who are precisely the first and most severely impacted by the effects of climate change. We've been dealing in the last while with, this winter's been mild, the last 2 winters before were brutally, terribly cold because of the whole volatility being created. The impact on the homeless population in Toronto was severe. The impact on poor people in terms of have substandard housing, precarious housing is enormous. The impact on people who don't have adequate diet is enormous. So there's a whole series of reasons why I think poor people have an interest in being like absolutely at the forefront of that struggle. But in the end, I mean, it didn't come up in the conversation in terms of what the particular issues we were talking about. But the thing that hangs over this whole discussion is the fact that we're living in a society that lives on a planet that's full of poison. And if we don't address that, then everything we're talking about is meaningless because there isn't going to be any future. And right now we're in a situation where dire warnings are being, we're not going to escape the effects of climate change, that's clear. But if we don't change course, and they're not changing course, I mean, they're going to these conferences in Paris and whatnot and coming up with all these wonderful resolutions, but I mean, Justin Trudeau is telling us that he's going to raise the revenue necessary to deal with climate change by building oil pipelines. I mean, if that's the approach, then we're done for. So it becomes, it's not just a question of building a just society, we've got to challenge this system to survive, and poor people need to be at the forefront of that.
One of the things that I was wondering about was how, you mentioned earlier, John, how there's a lot of the mining that's happening all over the world, and many of those are actually Canadian companies. But a lot of that continues to take place on Indigenous lands. I mean, that's where the actual resources are still left. The minerals that are used for all the different things that we rely on. So I'm just wondering how you, how do you attack it at that level? Because there are so many people within the, let's say, wanting to protect the environment that actually don't always necessarily make a connection to the fact that some of the, I guess, groups and some of the groups that they would be part of or think are doing a good thing in terms of climate change are actually still very much behind a lot of the mining that's being done for resources that only can be found on Indigenous lands. I mean, that sounds really convoluted, and I'm really sorry because there's just some things in there that when I'm reading sometimes I wonder, okay, so how do you, are we talking about, okay, no more mining? Like, should there be an end to mining oil in the ground? Oil in the ground, the components, the metals that are the components that are used in the, for generating, solar power, for generating, for the wind,
Turbine.
yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, so the two comments I have are people who already asked other questions. Is there someone who hasn't asked a question yet? Who wants to get in on the conversation?
Hi.
And then we'll go back to that.
Raising minimum wage, I think it's good. It improves people's dignity. But also, just in terms of going against colonialism, is there an argument to be made that it could be decolonizing? Increasing minimum wage to $15 an hour? Like right now I do it just to tell people, oh, at least it just improves people's lot in life. But is there any benefit going against capitalism or anti-colonialism?
Well, I mean, I think, unless I'm missing something, I mean, only in the sense that we're talking about addressing a whole process of super exploitation and trying to actually take back some of what is being stolen and actually raise people's living standards and raise the share that workers take back in the form of wages, the lowest paying workers, which I think strengthens the working class as a whole and strengthens the struggles that we're taking up. So, the raising of wage levels is always like one of the key demands of workers, and we have to, I think, really build this mentality of understanding. You know, the slogan always was, an injury to one is an injury to all, and I don't think we're going to be able to defend anyone if we don't address the question of dealing with people who are being thrown into poverty, either as workers or people who are on social assistance. It's got to be addressed, and we've got to build a united movement that fights to leave nobody behind.
And this one goes out to you. At the beginning of the presentation, you were saying that it's very important to constantly remember that we are on native land, and I think most of us here knew that yes, this is native land that we are on right here. But when you keep the mindset that we are on this stolen land all the time, what changes have you noticed in your behavior just in day-to-day life? Like, yes, I think we all know that, but if we are constantly reminding ourselves of this fact that yes, we are on stolen land, how will this change you?
Has it changed our practices?
Yes.
Well, maybe if the question's directed to me, I'll just say something really brief, and because I think we need to. There's still a couple of other people who want to talk. It means that we actually have to question really what it would actually mean is questioning people and challenging them every time they use the word Canada, and take it for granted, right? Because if you let the word Canada go by, not being challenged, you actually are burying the history and the continuing reality of the racism and colonialism and violence done towards Indigenous people. So for me as a white settler, it's a process of transformation, right? It's not like, you can transform yourself like in a second. It's a question of learning constantly as you can from Indigenous people. But I think it's also a question, this is what I describe as the politics of responsibility, that realizing that you're actually in an oppressor situation, that you have a particular responsibility to challenge other white settlers when they engage in the practices that produce colonialism. And it's important to point out, like, colonialism is not just something that people did in the past. It's something that lots of settlers still are engaged in and help to produce on a daily basis. So we need to stop doing that. We need to interrupt it. We need to challenge ourselves and to challenge other settlers when they engage in these practices. Is that helpful? Charles, you had a question. Anyone else?
Well, two of them. But one of them is, what's your take on the budget for $555 million over 2 years for improving housing? Do you think that's a good enough figure, or is it not enough?
I'm going to have to make a confession. I've been on the road and haven't really had as much chance. I'm going to get to it, but I haven't had the chance to go over the budget in very much detail.
Okay.
I mean, I think the glaring thing, of course, is that the scale of the loss of investment in housing since the early 90s has been absolutely devastating and enormous. And the other thing is that the redesign of housing that is taking place, to the extent that resources are being put in, and it's part of a broader question of a return to a notion of stimulus spending and infrastructure and all the rest of it, is that they're very much all reorganising this along lines of privatisation. In Toronto, there's been John Tory administration has now got the findings of a task force on public housing, and what they're looking to do is to reduce the rent geared to income component, and they're looking to hand things over to developers, and they're looking to use this model of condo communities with a minority low-income population that reduces over time. So I think the use of housing resources, we fight for housing resources, but they have to be under real public control, and they have to be about really providing social housing to low-income people, as opposed to being stalking horses for gentrification, which they've been to an enormous degree, and I fear are likely to be in the kind of a model that Trudeau is looking to set in motion.
Yeah. Okay, and
You had a second question.
do you think 21 grand a year for the guaranteed income is a good enough figure? And then having the healthcare provided as well as all of the above with farmer care and all that?
Likely not, but I mean, I think that the whole problem with, I mean, really in the end, the greatest problem with basic income is that, I mean, we can propose anything, but it's not just a question of what's proposed, it's a question of what gets implemented and who implements it.
Right.
So I think we've got to look at that very, very seriously. I mean,
Yeah.
I just shudder to think of another round of consultations done by the Wynne government on poverty reduction now becomes basic income, and we're going to build up a vision, and I know you're getting poorer, but never mind, in 20 years' time we're going to arrive at this final vision and everything's going to be wonderful. And I'm really worried about that. I'm really worried about that approach. We need to put forward really solid demands for adequate income, and we have to actually understand that they're not going to be won by eloquence, they're going to be won by struggle.
Okay, so what kind of figure in a year do you think is good enough to live with? Is it like around 25 grand a year, or
I don't know that I can answer.
you're not so sure on that one yet?
Family size based on where people live. We actually, I think, need to actually, as a movement, put forward those demands.
More studies to be made. Yeah. All right.
Gonna move on to.
Thanks very much for your talk. I really enjoyed everything. The questions, I'm thinking that we're not all equally oppressed, and we're not all equally oppressors. I'm just thinking about my relationship with my own conscience is what I'm thinking about in my own history, my own ancestral history with and relationships with the land and different philosophies that I've been exposed to throughout my life. And I just want to draw from your excellent historical analysis, and I'm thinking about the institutions and systems that we have in place now. And you left off with the poorhouses, Victorian poorhouses, and then you drew sort of a relationship between immigration and that system, right? And I'm just wondering if there are any, if you see any connections, what would you say are those institutions now that are most oppressive and most exploit the most vulnerable people? Or you mentioned that people that have disabilities that are particularly vulnerable to oppression, and I see that too, but trying to put the pieces together.
Yeah. Maybe will you collect your thoughts on that? We're probably, the class goes till 5:20, right? So we probably got time for another 2 questions after Moira's. So if people could think about them while John, maybe we'll take this one other question.
Mine's like not as shorter. It's how do you feel that the population is doing representing themselves and their issues and struggles that we, and do you feel like, I know you talked about in England how there's almost like a period of rise and fall of social unrest. Do you think that we're coming into something that might be considered social unrest sometime soon? How do you people communicate, form groups or advocacy groups and stuff like that?
Okay, so.
Yeah, I mean, sort of the key oppressive mechanisms at the moment, I think are, I mean, it depends what we were talking about. It's the way, certainly the way the immigration system is operating to create systems of super exploitation. It's certainly about how the workforce is being organised to create extreme precarity and low income wages. It's certainly about how income support systems and social programs are being reduced in terms of their adequacy and made more and more precarious, so that people are cut off them much more easily. In terms of Indigenous people, one of the really striking changes that I think has taken place is prison, right? The use of prisons. An article just appeared in Maclean's magazine, I don't know if you saw it, but it actually made the point that the prisons, if you look at the rates of incarceration amongst Indigenous people, you could make a case for saying that prisons are today's residential school system. And the massive overuse of incarceration, focused largely in the Indigenous population, but amongst other sections of the population too, is also a major question. The building up of the repressive state is very much part of it. The final point, just about, I suppose really what comes down to is potential for social unrest. Right? What are the prospects? What is the situation? I mean, there's all kinds of struggles that break out all the time. It's not like everybody's sitting around passive and nothing's happening. There's lots of resistance. Right now in Toronto, Black Lives Matter has a pact that they've established in the face of really vicious police intimidation, and they've established it and kept it. Our organisation fights every day in 1,000 different ways. Many people fight all sorts of ways. A kind of a mass movement of social resistance, that level of social unrest. The thing about those kinds of things is that they're incredibly unpredictable. And I believe that we're living in a situation that is creating the basis for those methods, for those kinds of upsurges of resistance. How and when they can emerge and what they look like. But the example I always like to give is the huge movement that arose a few years ago in Egypt. All of a sudden, whatever setbacks have occurred since, there was this mass movement that just brought down Mubarak government and created conditions of incredible unrest. I bet 2 weeks before that broke out, if you'd gone into Cairo and talked in terms of let's demonstrate against the government, people would have said, be quiet, what are you talking about? This is crazy. You know, but movements can happen very, very quickly. But when they do, the question is, what's been organised? What's on the ground? What possibilities are there for resistance? So I think a lot of the work we're doing is laying the basis for really big upsurges that are coming.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Is there?
On a smaller scale, in terms of education, if someone were to come to you and say that they don't believe that poverty is systemic or that it's a choice, what would you say to them? What would be your key points that you would bring up?
Well, I think you can just look at the incredible increase that has taken place in the levels of low-wage, precarious work. You can point to the figures that show how the adequacy of social assistance rates has been driven down. You can point to what people are actually receiving, and you can show the poverty that's there. You can show the increase in the number of people using food banks. You can show the increase in the number of people who are using emergency homeless shelters. I mean, those figures are all there. I think it's easy to demonstrate. But I think it's actually movements of resistance that create the feeling of, I mean, people may reluctantly acknowledge it, but it's only at a time when there's actual mobilisation and struggle that we really have the basis to bring people behind us. I don't think we can convince people that poverty needs to be resisted just by showing how bad things are. I think people need to see that a change is possible, that struggles can be taken.
Charles, is that a short question?
Yeah, I mean, just a comment, and then the point of, I mean, I've come to realize that homelessness and poverty cost taxpayers more money in the long run, ignoring people on the street, that it's costing a lot of resources in the long run. And I mean, I take it you'd agree upon that. And I mean, the other final question would be, what's your take on these days with rallying and protesting? Do you find it's effective these days? Or is more so online goods of doing phone call blitz and email blitz more useful?
I'm not sneering at anybody that does email blitzes, or it's part of building, but I think governments are going to respond to actually the notions of people actually just taking strong, collective, large-scale disruptive action. I think they already know that we don't like what they're doing.
Yeah.
The issue is to convince them we're not going to put up with it. stop doing this because we hold our breath.
Yeah.
We're going to have to actually show them we can change.
A lot of people think that rallying on the street is these days ineffective, and I mean, I come to take out the waste. They've listened to us many times.
Well, I mean, I think there are many examples, recent and historical, of the fact that social resistance is a powerful tool. I think
Yeah.
it's also true to say, and we address the question of the system itself, is that we can fight defensive resistance struggles, but
Yes.
we're going to have to build movements that reach the level where we can talk about the kind of society we want to live in, not just the kind of measures from a bad one that we want to stop.
Yeah, for sure. Okay.
Okay, so I think on that point, is there another question? Okay, very quick, small.
Yeah. I'm not even sure if it's a question. I find when I try to introduce people sometimes for the first time to the struggles of the feminist movement, I often have to suggest that the goals of the feminist movement actually would cover some issues that men are facing. Especially, and I always say, especially nowadays. I think more people are oppressed, even in a class structure now, and so when I point that out, I feel like I'm, including more people, and educating and just trying to suggest that a movement that seeks to end sexist oppression is good for all sexes, genders, etc. So when you were talking about the anti-colonial aspect, being a settler nation, a settler person, speaking to other settler people, and I'm thinking again of that ally, even accomplice building. If it was a question, does it make sense to you to point that out often, that to another settler, we need to be aware of these things, Indigenous struggle, and we need to be on board and seeking what they're suggesting they need, they want. Does it make sense to remind people that in a colonial state, even some settlers are uncomfortable with the way things are, and we need to go forward together?
Yeah, I think Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty is that, it's rights. So it's not that, I don't think we have to show it's, in that sense, it's to our advantage. I think it stands as something that by right should exist. But on the other hand, I do think it's fair to say, I can't imagine a situation where we say, well, we've built a society of human solidarity and justice where everything's based on human need. Now, what about that boiling water advisory at Shoal Lake? I mean, we're never going to build a just society if we don't make Indigenous rights, sovereignty, and justice absolutely.
Okay, I think on that note, we're going to have to end. Is there a class that comes in here right after? Okay, but maybe John could move, if there's people who want to more informally chat with John, maybe we could move into the hall and hold court there for a little while. So on behalf of everyone, I just want to thank John for and also a reminder that John is also speaking tomorrow morning at Laurantian University at 10 o'clock in the Upper Fraser Auditorium. He's talking there more about the practical struggles about challenging poverty and austerity in Ontario. And then the major event that John is here for is a community meal and meeting that's occurring tomorrow night starting at 5 o'clock with free food. John will be talking about building a movement to drive back the austerity agenda. So I hope that you can all come out to both of those events or one of them. That would be great. And again, thanks to John.